Hello and welcome to another Ponder Brain video. So today we'd like to talk about virtual reality and how virtual reality and the brain interact. But first I'd like to introduce my co-host for today, Natanya. Natanya and I are co-workers. In fact, we're co-founders of Cummings O'Sullivan Scientific Consultants. So that's where both of us are consultants. We're scientists, particularly interested in the areas of neuroscience, biomedical science, and technology. So Natanya, thank you so much for doing this with me today.
Oh no, thanks for having me, Kiefer. I'm really excited. This is my first video, so hopefully the internet can bear with me today.
Oh yeah, thank you for doing. We've definitely talked about this a few times before, and I think it's a piece of technology that is pretty fascinating, and it has a lot of increasing popularity behind it. And so the technology we're talking about today is virtual reality. And so if you don't know, I've got my virtual reality headset here. I kind of keep it next to me on the desk. Yeah, and I have an Oculus Quest 2. And so this is kind of basically what a virtual reality helmet looks like. You can see there's the two kind of holes for the eyes right there. And the basic thing is you would be throwing this over your face and you're looking into these two eye holes and you can basically look around, have full freedom of movement. I could be turning around, looking all the way up, down, and almost inhabiting a virtual world, right? And as well as that, if I was really doing virtual reality, I could have this strap over my head and it's a completely wireless, kind of hands free type of setup. And it's an incredibly immersive technology. I think, when you're in virtual reality, it's almost hard to explain to somebody who hasn't been in virtual reality because it's really like putting on that headset and going into another place, right? And so you can do a lot of different things. Like you could watch, something as simple as Netflix and have a virtual couch that you look down and see a virtual couch and look forward and see the virtual Netflix screen. Or you could play, video games and different simulations and different scenarios and different places for you to inhabit. So with this technology, we were really, really fascinated as neuroscientists in terms of how does this type of thing, affect the brain and interact with the brain because it surely does in a pretty interesting way. And so, as all good scientists do, we hit the literature and started, reading some of the literature on this topic. And we reviewed this particular paper. I think was very interesting to us both, and it was a paper from a children's hospital on the topic of pain. And of course, pain is one of the most widespread issues in our society today in terms of, how it affects people, especially in terms of like the healthcare costs and healthcare burden and so forth. And this particular paper, I think, focused on, pain from burns. So quite an acute form of pain, right, where somebody has suffered a particularly bad burn, and they wanted to investigate, how does virtual reality affect the sensation of pain. So Natanya, I know you've dived kind of into this paper, a good amount, and so what did you make of this paper? Why don't you give us kind of your overview?
Yeah, no, I thought it was really interesting. So the paper talks about pediatric procedural pain management. So procedural pain, they sort of define as a highly, unpleasant experience, like you said, that arises from acute tissue damage. And the interesting thing is that they actually found the virtual reality, head-mounted sets were the most effective at reducing pain in children ages 10 to 17. So I guess specifically adolescents. But it was interesting that it even performed better than standard care, opiate use, and also even just passive distraction. So a movie that was mounted on a tripod. And I thought it was especially interesting because, wow, excuse me.
It's a post-COVID world, folks.
Post-COVID
We're all a
world.
little messed up.
Yeah. So that they could relieve this severe episodic pain, not only after treatment, but during treatment. So even when they were doing the wound care, the VR was effective at reducing the experience of pain, or I guess nociception. So I guess I'll just tell you a little bit about the methods and the statistical analysis. So They grouped initially 30 adolescents, but the study only ended up including 28 of those into three separate groups. So again, one was the passive movie, one was just standard care, and one was the immersive helmet. So that was the experimental group. And then what they did was they gave them a pre-test and post-test. So they administered the Spielberger's state trait anxiety inventory for children and a pre-procedure questionnaire. So the procedure would have been the wound care. And then they did the adolescent pediatric pain tool, and they completed a post-procedure questionnaire. Then to see if there was any statistical significance or I guess clinical efficacy, they did a multivariable linear regression, and they adjusted for age, sex, pre-procedure pain levels, anxiety, opiate use, and treatment length. So they looked at a lot of different factors.
A lot of good stuff, and so I think it's pretty interesting as well that they had somebody watching a movie as one of their experimental groups, right? Which is very fascinating because it shows that what they were trying to do was that active distraction, right? I think that was the goal, and that was hypothesized how virtual reality would work. And so to see if it was something unique about virtual reality versus something that was just distraction from the film. I think they did find that it was like the virtual reality was pretty significantly better than
Yeah.
just watching a movie on a screen. I think they even watched was in Cloudy with the Chance of Meatballs. I think that was
Oh
that was
man,
the
that's one
film.
of my favorites,
Yeah,
along with
it's
Wally and all the other
so an
Disney
immersive
Plus.
movie, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's multimodal, right? And so
Mhm.
it's not just, your visual system, it can be tactile, it can be auditory. There's a lot of different ways to structure it, but the other thing too is that the brain doesn't really need these hyper realistic optics to feel as though it's enclosed in a synthetic kind of reality. So I
Mm.
thought that was interesting too, just from my own experience with VR, that I was expecting like something hyper realistic, and even though
Mhm.
the graphics are kind of choppy, I was still like fully into it.
Yeah,
But
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can totally get VR, simulations that are, very, we would consider it like low poly, right? Kind of like
yes,
not
yes,
high, well, it is high def, but it's not, high detail.
like
But and it's
Minecraft.
it's like it's like weird. It's like even though it's not a quote unquote realistic world, you get into it and your brain almost accepts it as an immersive reality. And
Yeah.
I think so much of that part maybe has to do with the depth perception and the
Mhm.
sense of space that virtual reality gives. And so I think another interesting point that I'd like to point out is kind of looking at their setup, right? So they were actually able to find some pretty efficacious results from using this in a pain scenario. And if you kind of zoom in here, we can see that this is their uh, virtual reality headset here. You can kind of see in this picture,
Mhm.
and it's not as intuitive as the one I've just shown, right? So you can kind of see it's like a little bit awkward, right? He's got looks like some over ear headphones here. I think they had
Yeah.
like some Bose headphones or something, and then he's looking into this um, kind of goggle like display that's kind of mounted on a tripod or some type of fixture, and he's got a looks like a mouse or like a scroll wheel or something interesting kind of going on there. And that setup, as let's just say as hypothetically awkward as that setup may potentially look, was found to be pretty efficacious in terms of it being a virtual reality type of treatment. And I think when you compare that to the what I showed at the beginning of this video, this very easy, I can just throw this on my head and in a couple of minutes it's wireless, it's hands free. They even have some like really convenient little ergonomic hand grip controllers that are
Yeah.
very intuitive, and your hand just molds to it very naturally, so there's not so much of a learning curve. So you could imagine from that perspective, with the increasing technological advances in virtual reality, how much more effective, or theoretically, how much more effective these more immersive headsets and these more, these lighter load headsets that are, allow you to be in a much more natural posture,
Yeah.
and how much more effective those could be. I think that's pretty interesting.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Sorry to interrupt, but you made me think of something. How in, for example, people that are experiencing PTSD like symptoms,
Hmm.
sometimes they don't even have to experience the actual traumatic event. But there was even a phenomenon of psychiatrists and psychologists listening repeatedly, or crisis response teams, witnessing these traumatic events, and you sort of get this secondhand traumatic response from the brain. And so it's really interesting how our brains are wired to just adapt to any given situation, and how those symptoms can persist even if you haven't experienced them directly. So it's again similar to how in VR the brain will just accept, oh, this is my kind of new synthetic reality for the time being. And yeah, hopefully these effects persist. Like, we haven't really looked at whether or not this is sort of something that the brain can be trained to do. And I think you had mentioned just in our talks about attentional networks and how they could be modified through this. But
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's one of the most interesting aspects. I think that is, one of the, let's say, almost causative or mechanistic factors that's actually providing the analgesia, right? The analgesia being that pain relief. And that is that modulation of attentional networks. And so that's really what's going on, I think, with virtual reality is it's such a captivating draw for your attention span that
mm-hmm.
that very much plays into your body's feedback systems and how it relates to
Absolutely.
itself, particularly in regards to pain, right? So I think pain, pain in the brain, right? When we think about pain in the brain, pain in the nervous system, it's really has a lot to do with emotion and attention. And so
Mm-hmm.
virtual reality works very much on that attentional aspect of things. And so here's, there's a illustrative story I've told a few times, and I've mentioned this in a few courses and in a few interviews I've done, regarding illustrating how attention affects pain. And, it kind of goes like this. So imagine you are, you know, at home, you're relaxed, there's nothing else going on. Maybe you're walking around your apartment, your house, your garden, whatever it happens to be, and you stub your toe. And it's just the worst pain ever. One of those ones you stub your toe really bad and it feels like you almost like separated the toe off the foot or something, just something
You
really
cry uncontrollably, you screech,
yeah.
you.
Yeah, you curse, you're so
Yeah.
annoyed, and that's the emotional aspect too, right? Automatically there's a lot of negative emotionality associated with that because you're like, "Ah, damn it, why did I do that?" And you almost
You
want to
could be
like
the most poised person, but a stub toe will just shatter that illusion.
yeah, and it's like you'll be like a grown person being like, oh, "I want to punch this damn chair that just, jutted out so, crazily and injured me." And you get, there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on. It's very interesting. So, take that context, right? In that context, since there was nothing else going on, you had a lot of time to give, attention to that pain. That was the only thing in your sphere in that moment was that pain, was the pain in your toe. And you're looking down at your toe, you're giving your toe attention, you're giving the pain attention. And that, in fact, gives the experience of pain, the perception of pain, because that's really kind of what pain is. It's a perception, and it amplifies it. And you would rate that pain pretty high on a scale out of 10, let's say. And let's take another example, right? So let's just say it's really early in the morning, you've been running late for work, and you take a bus to work. And you're running late, you've got all your bags and stuff there, you're running down the street, and you see the bus that you need to take to get to work to not be late for work. And it's really imperative that you catch this bus, or else it's going to open up a whole can of worms, and you don't want to have to get an Uber, and it's going to be a big issue. So for that, let's imagine you're running down the street, you're chasing this bus, and you stub your toe. And you stub your toe in the exact same way as you did at home, right? So in this context, do you feel the pain in the same way? And it's an interesting example, right? Because the answer is really likely not. Maybe you would have some sensation of it, but in that context, you wouldn't be like, oh, I need to stop and,
Everything. And yeah.
yeah, and do the whole rigmarole that you did at home, let's say. But you
Yeah.
wouldn't do that. You would be 100% focusing on, oh, I stubbed my toe, whatever. I got to catch that bus. I got to catch that
Mm-hmm.
bus. And so in that moment, let's just say for the 5 to 10 seconds after that, toe stubbing injury, you would probably your perception of that pain is a lot less than it was when you gave it all your attention before. And so I think that's an example that a lot of us can relate to in terms of how attention affects pain. And so that's kind of how virtual reality can very much alter our perception of pain by being such a captivating and immersive way of pulling your attention into something that is not your body, right? Something that is not your painful system, that is not your injury or whatever your own personal situation is. So I think that's a pretty fascinating avenue of how VR is going to be increasingly used and explored and researched for really how it affects the brain in these very different ways and how impactful that is.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
Natanya, any last thoughts on virtual reality, the brain, and pain, and all this kind of stuff we're talking about today?
Well, I first of all, I think that's a great example and one I can relate to because, as you know, I'm usually late. Unfortunately, I don't know what it is. We were talking about nociception, but I don't have time perception, so there's
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Pain is just a perception, right? Or time is just a perception,
Yeah,
right? So it
yeah.
all
Well,
is just
that's a whole other video,
yeah,
quantum mechanics.
yeah,
But yeah, no, I thought it was not only compelling that they picked such an acute situation. I mean, like burn victims, right?
yeah. That's intense
And
pain.
that it
Yeah,
ended up being effective. But also, there's the added benefit that you can potentially replace pharmacological interventions. So, especially with opioid use and synthetic analogs like fentanyl becoming so widespread, it's
yeah,
interesting that this could address that by preventing people from even being exposed to those kinds of addictive interventions in the first place. So
yeah.
I forget what the statistic was. I think the last one I read was like to 20, no, 10,000 Canadians die prematurely from accidental overdose.
Oh wow.
And that's
Yeah.
strictly fentanyl related or opioid
Mm.
related. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's very similar in the states where it's the numbers are crazy, and fentanyl, the numbers are crazy, and then opioids and opiates, and since the opiate crisis and epidemic in general, I think it's been
Yeah.
a pretty rough time, health wise, and emotion wise for a lot of the
Mhm.
families that are touched by this, or people that go in for maybe a surgery or an injury or something like that, and months later they find themselves with a nasty addiction or
That's
something that
right.
they didn't quite expect. And
Yeah.
that was that's an excellent point from this paper, because they did find that virtual reality, that those that went through a virtual reality treatment reported less pain than the opiate people,
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
is almost wild when you think about it, right? Because I think in today's day and age, painkillers and things that especially opiates, right, which work with the central nervous system, are considered pretty heavy pain killing entities. And to
Hmm.
have something that's non pharmacological, that's something that's, I think this is like a 3 to $400 headset, something like that, that has a effect that can be compared to opiates, I think is just fascinating.
Sorry, I had to clear my throat. Yes, no, I, I, I definitely agree. And I like that medicine is kind of going this direction, exploring things like this. And, we've talked about neuromodulation and
Hmm.
photobiomodulation, and there's just always these
Yeah.
advances that are basically trying to improve upon what we already have. So, not to say we should throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, ixnay on all the pharmaceutical interventions, but
Hmm.
it is nice to have these sort of alternatives for sure. So,
Absolutely, yeah, and it's as we're yeah, as you said it perfectly, right? And as we're kind of getting more and more into the understanding of the nervous system, we're finding these non-invasive ways of getting the same outcomes as treatments in the past that are maybe more invasive or have side effects or unintended consequences.
yeah.
So with that, I think that's been a good VR video, and we're gonna do more in this series. So if folks at home, if you enjoyed what you've seen today, give us a like, a share, subscribe, all that fun YouTube stuff that helps us do what we do and continue what we're doing. As well, leave us a comment with your questions or your experiences, or ideas, or if you've anything anything that you would like to see us talk about in future videos or address or research. We love to get your feedback. So from Netanya and I, again, we are consultants, we're scientists. You can find us at coscientists.com, and fascinating video.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.